He thought he could do whatever he wanted in that diner, until he chose the wrong day and the wrong witness. What happened next will surprise you, so watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The diner had been standing on that corner longer than most of the people who worked inside it. Its red leather booths were cracked from decades of bodies sliding in and out. The vinyl split in places and patched clumsily with darker strips that never quite matched. The floor creaked with every step, not in protest but in tired acknowledgement, as if it knew exactly how much weight it could still bear. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee, fried bacon, and old grease that no amount of cleaning could ever fully erase. Morning light filtered through wide front windows, streaked with faint scratches, dust catching in the sun like tiny floating witnesses to the routine that played out every day. This place ran on habit. The bell above the door rang with the same dull sound each time someone entered, and the same few heads turned automatically, checking who it was before returning to their plates. The same customers came in at the same hours, ordered the same meals, complained about the same things, and left the same tips. The walls were decorated with fading photographs of baseball teams and newspaper clippings that no one read anymore. Time did not move here so much as circle endlessly, grinding people down until they learned to move with it rather than against it. She had learned that lesson early. The waitress had been on her feet since before sunrise, and the ache in her calves had settled into a dull, constant throb that no longer surprised her. She moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, balancing trays and plates as though they were extensions of her own body. Her uniform, once crisp and bright, had been washed so many times that the fabric had softened into something closer to resignation than comfort. A few strands of hair escaped her ponytail and clung to her forehead, damp with sweat despite the mild weather outside. She told herself she was lucky to have this job. She repeated it like a prayer, especially on days when she worked double shifts. Lucky because rent did not wait. Lucky because the bills on her kitchen table did not care about exhaustion or dignity. Lucky because there were worse places to work, or so people said. The truth was that she stayed because fear was quieter than hunger, and fear had become familiar. Around her, the diner filled steadily as the lunch hour approached. Plates clattered, forks scraped against porcelain, and conversations overlapped into a low, constant hum. A few coworkers moved alongside her, their faces carrying the same carefully neutral expressions she wore. They had learned not to react too strongly to anything. Emotion here was a liability. At the counter, the manager stood with his arms crossed, watching the room with the detached focus of someone counting minutes instead of people. He had once been louder, more opinionated, but years of complaints and confrontations had worn him down. Now he chose silence as often as possible, convinced that not noticing problems was the same as solving them. The doorbell rang again, and the atmosphere shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. A few conversations paused for half a second before resuming at a slightly lower volume. Someone at the counter sighed quietly. The waitress did not need to look to know who had entered. He came in like he owned the place, his posture loose and confident, boots heavy against the floor. The badge on his chest caught the light briefly as he passed the windows, a small, polished symbol that seemed to grant him permission to behave however he pleased. He wore his uniform the way some men wore armor, fully aware of the way it changed how people looked at him. Chairs scraped as he pulled one out without asking, settling into his usual booth near the center of the room. "Coffee," he said, not to anyone in particular, his voice loud enough to carry. "And don't make it weak today." The waitress felt her shoulders tighten before she consciously told them not to. She picked up a pot and approached his table, already bracing herself for whatever tone he chose to take next. He watched her as she poured, his eyes lingering longer than necessary, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Long face today," he remarked. "Smile a little. Makes the place look better." A few nearby customers chuckled. Others pretended not to hear. The manager glanced over, then looked away just as quickly, busying himself with something behind the counter that did not need his attention. She forced a polite expression and murmured something neutral, setting the cup down carefully. Inside, something twisted, a familiar mixture of anger and humiliation that she had learned to swallow. It was easier that way. Arguing never ended well, especially when the man doing the talking wore a badge and a gun. This was not new. Everyone in the diner knew it. He had been coming here for months, always in uniform, always loud, always testing how far he could go. He made comments, demanded special treatment, complained about service that everyone else accepted without issue. Each time the response was the same. Awkward laughter, lowered eyes, silence. Silence was the rule that kept things running smoothly. As she moved away from his table, balancing another tray, she felt the weight of the room pressing in around her. The narrow aisle between the booths seemed tighter than usual, crowded with bodies and expectations. She reminded herself to watch her step, to be careful. Careful had become second nature. Near the far side of the diner, an older man sat alone at a booth by the window. He had arrived quietly, taken a seat without drawing attention, and ordered a simple meal. His plaid shirt was neatly buttoned, his hands resting on the table as though he had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to be there. He did not speak much, but his eyes moved constantly, following the flow of the room with calm attentiveness. He noticed the way the waitress's smile faded the moment she turned away from the officer's table. He noticed the manager's deliberate indifference and the way nearby customers leaned into their conversations, eager to avoid involvement. He noticed details most people had trained themselves to ignore. The lunch rush grew heavier, and the sounds of the diner swelled. Orders piled up, and the waitress found herself moving faster, her exhaustion sharpening her focus instead of dulling it. She told herself she just needed to get through the next hour. After that, things might slow down. After that, she could breathe. From his booth, the officer leaned back and stretched, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He watched her cross the aisle again, a look of idle amusement on his face. The older man by the window watched too, though his expression did not change. The diner carried on, trapped in its routine, unaware that the silence it depended on was already beginning to crack. By the time the lunch rush fully took hold, the diner felt like a sealed room with no fresh air. Voices overlapped in an uneven rhythm, plates slid across counters, and the bell above the door rang often enough to lose any meaning. To anyone passing by, it looked like a place doing good business. To those inside, it felt like endurance. The police officer sat in his usual booth as if it had been built specifically for him. He leaned back with an ease that suggested complete ownership, one arm draped casually along the top of the seat, the other resting near his coffee cup. The badge on his chest caught glances, whether he intended it to or not. People noticed it before they noticed his face. That was how it always worked, and he knew it. He had learned long ago what the uniform did to a room. It straightened backs, quieted voices, and created a careful distance that people rarely crossed. Even those who disliked him found themselves hesitating, measuring their words, choosing silence over risk. He enjoyed that pause, that moment when people recalculated themselves around him. It made him feel solid, anchored, immune to consequences. To the regular customers, he was a fixture. Some of them nodded to him out of habit. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few laughed too loudly at his remarks, mistaking agreement for safety. The waitress saw all of it from the corner of her eye as she moved between tables, delivering plates and refilling glasses with the same practiced motions. She had served him often enough to recognize the pattern. It always began with a demand disguised as a joke. Then came the criticism, delivered loudly enough for others to hear. Finally, the expectation of compliance, as though obedience were simply part of the service. "Hey," he called out as she passed his booth again, carrying a tray heavy with plates. "You forget about me already?" She stopped, turned, and forced herself to meet his gaze. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady as she asked what he needed. The older man by the window watched this exchange carefully, his attention fixed not on the words but on the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders drew inward just slightly. The officer smirked. "Relax. I'm just saying, service used to be faster around here. Or maybe you're just distracted." A few people glanced over. Someone snorted quietly into their coffee. The manager looked up, took in the scene, and then turned away again, choosing a register that did not need balancing over a confrontation he did not want. The waitress nodded and apologized, though she knew she had done nothing wrong. Apologies had become a reflex, one that required no thought and offered no relief. As she moved away, she felt the familiar burn of embarrassment rise in her chest, followed by a deeper frustration she kept carefully contained. The officer watched her go, satisfied. He enjoyed the effect he had on people, the way they bent around him without being told to. In his mind, it was not cruelty, it was order. He believed that firmly, even proudly. People needed to know their place, and he was simply reminding them. Around him, the diner continued its dance of avoidance. Conversations resumed, but at a lower volume. A man at the counter shifted uncomfortably and focused on his plate. A woman in the next booth whispered something to her companion, then fell silent when the officer glanced her way. The older man by the window did not look away. His eyes followed the officer's movements with quiet precision. He noticed how the man spread himself in the booth, how his boots extended farther into the aisle than necessary. He noticed how his laughter was timed, how it followed moments of discomfort rather than humor. These were not accidents. They were choices. As the waitress returned to the kitchen to pick up another order, she allowed herself a single deep breath. Her hands trembled briefly as she steadied the tray. She told herself she could endure this, just as she had endured it before. The idea of speaking up felt distant and unrealistic, like imagining a different life entirely. When she stepped back into the dining area, the narrow aisle between the booths seemed even more crowded. Plates passed close to elbows and chairs jutted out at odd angles. She adjusted her grip on the tray and focused on the path ahead, reminding herself to stay alert. The officer shifted in his seat, watching her approach. His gaze flicked briefly to the aisle, then back to her face. A faint smile crossed his lips, the kind that did not reach his eyes. To him, this was a game, one played in small, deniable gestures. He knew exactly how far he could go without drawing open challenge. The older man saw the look and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It was the recognition of a pattern he had seen before, in different places and different forms. Power testing boundaries, silence allowing it. He took a sip of his coffee, still warm, and waited. The waitress passed the officer's booth again, this time closer, her attention split between balancing the tray and navigating the aisle. He said nothing as she went by, but his presence felt heavier, more deliberate. She felt it without understanding why, a tension she could not quite name. Behind the counter, the manager glanced at the clock and frowned. The rush would last another hour at least. He told himself he would deal with problems later, when things calmed down. Later had become his favorite word. The officer leaned back further, stretching his legs beneath the table. One boot slid forward just enough to intrude into the aisle, though not so much that anyone could accuse him outright. He watched the waitress with lazy interest, already imagining the outcome he expected. If anything happened, it would be her fault. It always was. The older man noticed the movement immediately. His gaze sharpened, his attention narrowing to the space between the officer's boot and the path the waitress was taking. The room seemed to slow, the noise fading into a distant murmur as anticipation settled over him. Around them, the diner continued to function, unaware that something fragile was about to break. The silence that had kept everything in place for so long held steady, stretched thin by habit and fear. No one spoke. No one intervened. For the waitress, it was just another step in another long shift, taken under the weight of expectation and exhaustion. She did not see the boot until it was too late. The moment did not arrive with any warning. It did not announce itself with raised voices or sudden movement. It slipped into the diner quietly, wrapped in the ordinary sounds of a busy lunch hour, hiding behind the clatter of plates and the low murmur of conversation. The waitress stepped into the aisle with the practiced rhythm she had perfected over years of work. The tray in her hands was heavier than usual, loaded with plates meant for a booth near the far wall. Her fingers tightened slightly around its edge as she adjusted her balance, her eyes flicking ahead to map out a clear path. She had learned to anticipate obstacles before they appeared, to navigate bodies and furniture with the precision of someone who could not afford mistakes. The aisle felt narrower now, crowded by chairs pulled back and boots that edged just a little too far out. She shifted her weight forward, committing to the next step. That was when her foot met resistance. It was not a shove, not a kick, just enough pressure to stop her stride abruptly. Her shoe caught against something solid, unyielding, exactly where the floor should have been clear. For a fraction of a second, her body did not understand what had happened. Momentum carried her forward while her foot remained trapped, and the world tilted in a way that made her stomach drop. Her knee bent instinctively, trying to compensate. The tray lurched in her hands, plates sliding against each other with a sharp, unmistakable scrape. Her free foot searched for the floor, her muscles straining to recover balance that had already begun to slip away. Time stretched thin, every sensation amplified in that brief instant. Then the sound came. Porcelain struck the floor with a brittle crash, followed by the splatter of food and the dull clatter of silverware. The noise cut through the diner like a blade. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The bell above the door rang faintly as someone entered, then fell silent again. She managed not to fall completely. Somehow she caught herself against the edge of a booth, her heart hammering violently in her chest. One hand clenched the remaining edge of the tray while the other braced against the seat. Her breath came shallow and fast, her face flushed with a sudden burning heat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then laughter rippled through the room. It began at the officer's booth, low and confident, and spread unevenly as others joined in. Not everyone laughed, but enough did to make the sound unmistakable. A few people smiled awkwardly, unsure whether they were allowed to find it funny. Others glanced down at their plates, pretending to be absorbed in their meals. The officer leaned back in his seat, his laughter unrestrained. His boot remained exactly where it had been, planted in the aisle as though it belonged there. He raised his hand slightly in mock surprise, shaking his head. "Careful there," he said loudly. "You really ought to watch where you're going." The words landed harder than the fall itself. The implication was clear, rehearsed, delivered with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed. He did not look at the spilled food or the broken plates. He looked at her, waiting for the expected response. Her mouth opened, then closed again. A dozen thoughts collided in her mind, none of them forming words she felt safe enough to speak. She looked down at the mess on the floor, at the fragments of what had been moments ago a routine task. Her hands trembled now, no longer able to hide the shock running through her. From behind the counter, the manager stepped forward, his face already set into an expression of weary irritation. He surveyed the scene quickly, his eyes moving from the broken plates to the officer, then settling on the waitress. "What happened?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer he expected. "She tripped," the officer replied smoothly. "Nearly took me out with her." A few people chuckled again. The waitress swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt heavy and dangerous. The manager sighed, rubbing his forehead as though this were an inconvenience rather than an injustice. "You need to be more careful," he said to her. "We can't afford mistakes like this." The shame hit her in a wave so strong it made her lightheaded. She nodded automatically, bending down to gather the pieces of broken plate, her fingers brushing against the cold floor. Each movement felt exposed, every second stretched under the weight of watching eyes. The officer continued to grin, sipping his coffee as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. His boot finally withdrew from the aisle, retreating casually beneath the table. The absence of it felt almost mocking, as though it had never been there at all. At the far booth by the window, the older man had not moved. His coffee sat untouched now, steam rising slowly from the cup. He had seen everything. The precise placement of the boot, the moment her foot caught, the split second of hesitation before gravity took over. There had been no accident here, no clumsiness, only intent, followed by denial. He watched the waitress crouched on the floor, her shoulders drawn inward as she cleaned up the mess that was not hers to own. He watched the officer's satisfied expression and the manager's quiet complicity. Something settled heavily in his chest, a familiar weight he had hoped never to feel again. Around them, the diner resumed its rhythm. Conversations restarted, though more cautiously now. Plates were replaced. Orders were shouted back to the kitchen. The sound of laughter faded, leaving behind an uneasy quiet that no one addressed. The waitress straightened slowly, her hands sticky with spilled food. She avoided looking at anyone as she carried the remains of the tray toward the kitchen. Her legs felt weak, her balance uncertain, as though the floor itself could no longer be trusted. Behind her, the officer took another sip of coffee, satisfied. He had proven his point without consequence. The silence of the room had done the rest. At the window, the older man finally set his cup down. His gaze followed the waitress as she disappeared behind the swinging doors. The crack in the diner's silence had widened, and he knew it would not close again. The kitchen was louder than the dining room, but it felt safer in ways the waitress could not fully explain. The hiss of the grill and the clatter of pans created a wall of sound that wrapped around her, muting the echoes of laughter and judgment she had left behind. She stood at the stainless steel counter, hands braced against its cool surface, trying to slow her breathing. The smell of grease and onions clung to her clothes, grounding her in something tangible when her thoughts threatened to scatter. Her reflection stared back at her from a dull metal panel. Her face looked older than it had that morning, the lines around her eyes deeper, her mouth set in a way she did not recognize. She wiped her hands on a towel, noticing how they still trembled despite her efforts to steady them. The broken plates lay in a bin nearby, fragments stacked together like evidence that would never be examined. She told herself to move. There were orders waiting, tables expecting service, a rhythm she needed to rejoin before it slipped out of reach. But her feet refused to respond immediately. The moment in the aisle replayed itself again and again in her mind, each time sharper, more humiliating. The pressure against her foot, the sudden loss of balance, the sound of laughter that followed, it all merged into a single, crushing weight that pressed down on her chest. For years, she had learned to absorb moments like this quietly. She had convinced herself that endurance was strength, that silence was a form of survival. It was easier to accept blame than to risk retaliation, easier to apologize than to explain. That logic had carried her through countless small humiliations, each one filed away and forgotten in the name of practicality. But this time felt different. This time, something had shifted. When she finally pushed through the swinging doors and stepped back into the dining room, the noise struck her all at once. The lunch rush had not slowed. If anything, it had grown louder, as though the incident had only sharpened everyone's appetite for distraction. She forced herself to walk with purpose, her posture straight despite the tightness in her muscles. The officer was still there, of course. He sat comfortably in his booth, one arm draped along the backrest, his expression relaxed and open. He spoke animatedly to a man at the neighboring table, his voice carrying easily over the din. When he noticed her returning, his eyes flicked toward her briefly, a flash of amusement passing across his face before he looked away again. She felt her jaw tighten. The absence of apology, of acknowledgement, burned more than an insult ever could. He had not only escaped consequence, he had been rewarded with silence and compliance. The knowledge settled heavily in her stomach. As she passed the counter, the manager caught her eye. For a moment she thought he might say something, an apology, perhaps, or even a question. Instead, he gestured toward a table that needed clearing, his face already turning away. The message was clear. The incident was over as far as he was concerned. Work remained. She nodded and moved on, though the motion felt automatic, disconnected from any real agreement. Each step carried her farther from the version of herself that had accepted this kind of treatment without question. That version still existed, hovering close, but it no longer felt like the only option. The officer's voice rose suddenly, cutting through the noise of the room. "You okay back there?" he called out, not unkindly on the surface. "Wouldn't want you hurting yourself again." A few heads turned. The words were framed as concern, but the laughter that followed revealed their true intent. She stopped short, the tray in her hands feeling heavier than before. Her first instinct was to respond with the usual script, to reassure him and everyone else that she was fine, that it had been her fault. This time the words stuck in her throat. She stood there frozen, the room waiting in a way that felt unbearable. Heat rushed to her face, and she felt the familiar urge to disappear, to retreat into the kitchen and let the moment pass. But something held her in place. The memory of her foot catching, the sound of plates shattering, the way no one had spoken up. It all pressed forward, demanding acknowledgement. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was simply a statement of fact. The officer tilted his head slightly, studying her. For a moment his expression hardened, as though he were deciding how far to push. Then he smiled again, leaning back in his seat. "Good," he said. "Just be careful next time." The tension did not dissipate when she moved away. If anything, it spread, settling into the corners of the room where people pretended not to notice it. A woman in the next booth watched her with something like sympathy before quickly looking away. A man at the counter shifted uncomfortably, his fork hovering above his plate. At the far end of the diner, the older man by the window had been watching everything unfold. He had seen the way the waitress paused, the way her shoulders squared just slightly when she spoke. It was a small change, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. But he noticed. He noticed the officer's reaction as well, the calculation behind the smile. He knew this moment. He had seen it before, in different forms, in places far removed from this quiet diner. The moment when a line was tested, when silence was challenged just enough to provoke a response. It was a dangerous moment, one that could end in retreat or escalation, and it rarely ended on its own. The officer seemed energized by the exchange. He began to speak more loudly, his jokes sharper, his comments edged with an unmistakable challenge. Each remark was carefully crafted to remain just within the bounds of deniability. Anyone listening could convince themselves it was harmless. Anyone watching closely could see the intent behind it. The waitress moved through the room with renewed focus, determined not to let him see how deeply his words affected her. But the effort took its toll. Her hands ached from gripping trays too tightly. Her shoulders burned with tension. She caught herself flinching when laughter rose unexpectedly, her body bracing for another blow that might not come. The manager remained conspicuously absent from the situation. He busied himself with paperwork, then with the register, then with tasks that allowed him to avoid eye contact. Each time the officer spoke up, the manager's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned that intervention brought complications, and complications threatened stability. Stability, however fragile, was his priority. The older man felt a familiar frustration stir within him. He had spent much of his life navigating systems that depended on silence, on the willingness of bystanders to look away. He had learned the cost of inaction, not through theory, but through experience. Sitting there now, he felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against him. He watched the waitress clear a nearby table, her movements precise and controlled. He saw the way she avoided the officer's gaze, not out of fear alone, but out of resolve. She was holding herself together through sheer will, and he knew how quickly that could collapse under continued pressure. The officer's attention returned to her again as she passed his booth. He shifted in his seat, angling his body toward the aisle. His posture was casual, almost lazy, but the intent was unmistakable. He was testing her, the room, the limits of what he could do without being challenged. The older man's patience thinned. He did not feel anger in the explosive sense people often imagine. What he felt was a steady, clarifying resolve. He understood that moments like this did not resolve themselves through hope or endurance. They resolved themselves through action, through someone willing to disrupt the pattern. He thought of the countless times he had walked past injustice because it seemed smaller than the risks involved. He thought of the faces he could no longer forget, the moments that returned to him uninvited in quiet hours. He had promised himself long ago that he would not be silent again when it mattered. Across the room, the waitress set a tray down and straightened, her eyes briefly meeting his. It was an accidental connection, fleeting and unspoken, but it carried weight. In her expression, he saw exhaustion, yes, but also something else. A question, perhaps, or a hope she did not dare voice. The officer laughed again, louder this time, drawing attention back to himself. The sound grated against the older man's nerves. He finished his coffee in a single swallow and placed the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. The gesture felt ceremonial, a quiet acknowledgement of a decision already made. The diner continued its routine, oblivious to the shift that had taken place. Plates moved, orders were called, the bell rang again as someone entered. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The silence that had governed the room for so long was no longer intact. It wavered, uncertain. The older man slid out of his booth and stood. He did not rush. There was no urgency in his movements, only purpose. He adjusted his shirt, smoothing the fabric as though preparing for an ordinary conversation. To anyone watching casually, he might have seemed like just another customer stretching his legs. But to the officer who noticed him rising from the corner of his eye, Something felt off. The laughter caught briefly in his throat as he turned his head, curiosity flickering across his face. The waitress saw him too. She paused mid-step, her heart pounding as she watched the older man take a slow step toward the aisle. She did not know what he intended, only that his calm presence cut through the noise of the diner in a way nothing else had. The breaking point had arrived, not with a shout or a crash, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided that silence was no longer an option. When the older man stepped into the aisle, the movement barely registered at first. In a room accustomed to constant motion, one more figure rising from a booth did not seem remarkable. Chairs scraped, plates shifted, and the steady rhythm of the diner carried on without pause. But something about the way he moved caused a subtle change, a faint hesitation in the noise that no one could quite explain. He did not hurry. His boots touched the floor softly, deliberately, each step placed with care. The plaid shirt hung loosely on his broad frame, worn but clean, and his posture was straight without being rigid. There was no aggression in his stance, no theatrical display meant to draw attention. He walked as a man walks when he knows exactly where he is going. The waitress watched him approach with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Her instinct was to retreat, to make herself smaller, to remove herself from whatever was about to happen. Years of habit urged her to disappear before trouble found her again. Yet she stayed where she was, frozen by curiosity and a fragile thread of hope she did not fully understand. The officer noticed him then. His laughter faded as his eyes tracked the older man's path through the diner. At first, his expression held only mild interest, the casual assessment of someone used to being the most dominant presence in any room. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as though settling in to watch a minor inconvenience unfold. The older man stopped beside the officer's booth, close enough that their proximity could not be ignored, but not so close as to feel threatening. He looked down at him calmly, his gaze steady and unblinking. "Mind stepping outside with me for a minute?" he asked. His voice was even, unhurried, carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearest to them. There was no anger in it, no accusation. It was the kind of voice one used when discussing ordinary matters, when expecting compliance rather than resistance. The diner went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Conversations faltered, words trailing off into silence. The clatter of dishes slowed, then stopped entirely. Even the grill in the kitchen seemed to hiss more softly, as though aware it was intruding. The officer blinked, surprised. He glanced around, registering the attention focused on him, and a grin spread across his face. "Outside?" he repeated, amused. "For what?" The older man did not look away. "For a conversation," he said simply. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room, quickly stifled. The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "You got a problem with something?" he asked, his tone light but edged now with challenge. "I do," the older man replied, "and I think it's better handled away from everyone else." The waitress held her breath. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, loud and insistent. Part of her wanted to warn him, to tell him to leave it alone, to protect himself before the situation turned against him. She had seen how these things usually ended. People who spoke up rarely walked away unscathed. The manager hovered near the counter, his hands clenched together. He looked as though he might intervene, then thought better of it. His eyes darted between the two men, calculating risks he did not want to take. The officer studied the older man more closely now. He seemed to take in the lines of his face, the calm certainty in his posture, the lack of hesitation in his eyes. Something flickered across his expression, a brief uncertainty quickly masked by bravado. "You trying to tell me how to behave?" he asked, his voice louder now. "I'm asking you to step outside," the older man said. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. The silence deepened. The officer shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering just enough to be noticeable. He was accustomed to intimidation, to people backing down when challenged. This was different. The man standing before him did not seem impressed by the uniform, the badge, or the authority they represented. After a moment, the officer laughed again, though the sound rang hollow. "Fine," he said, pushing himself up from the booth. "Let's talk." He stood, towering slightly as he straightened, and for a brief instant, the room held its breath. The waitress felt a surge of fear, convinced she was about to witness something she could not unsee. The older man stepped aside, gesturing toward the door with a small tilt of his head. They walked together through the diner, the officer leading by half a step, the older man following calmly. The bell above the door rang as they passed beneath it, the sound sharp and loud in the sudden quiet. Then they were gone. For a long moment, no one moved. The waitress exhaled slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping its edge to steady herself. Around her, people exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked relieved, others unsettled. A few stared at the door, as though expecting it to open again at any second. The manager cleared his throat and spoke at last, his voice strained. Let's get back to work," he said, clapping his hands together weakly. The spell broke, though not completely. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The clatter of dishes returned, softer now, as though everyone were testing the volume they were allowed to use. The waitress moved on instinct, clearing a table, refilling a glass, her mind still fixed on the two men outside. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. Every sound from the parking lot made her heart jump. She imagined raised voices, fists, flashing lights. She imagined consequences she did not want to face. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of asphalt and exhaust. The officer stopped near his patrol car, turning to face the older man, with a grin that no longer felt convincing. "So," he said, "you got something to say? Say it." The older man met his gaze evenly. "You don't treat people like that," he said. The officer scoffed. "Like what? You mean jokes? Accidents?" He gestured vaguely toward the diner. "Lighten up. That wasn't an accident," the older man replied. The officer's smile faded. "You accusing me of something?" "I'm telling you I saw it," he said, "and I saw what came after." The officer's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked away, then back again, his expression hardening. "You think you know what you saw?" "I do." The conversation ended there. What followed did not carry across the parking lot in shouts or dramatic gestures. There were no drawn-out exchanges, no spectacle meant for an audience. Whatever happened unfolded quickly, decisively, and without witnesses. Inside the diner, the waitress wiped the same spot on a table twice without realizing it. Her thoughts raced, her body braced for the unknown. She had spent so long believing that speaking up only made things worse that she could not imagine another outcome. The bell above the door rang again. Heads turned in unison as the door opened. The older man stepped back inside, his expression unchanged, his movements as calm as they had been before. A moment later, the officer followed. He did not look the same. His posture had shifted, his shoulders drawn inward, as though carrying a weight he had not anticipated. His gaze avoided the room, fixed instead on the floor a few feet ahead of him. The confidence that had filled the diner earlier was gone, replaced by something brittle and restrained. No one spoke as he walked back to his booth, collected his jacket, and left without a word. The bell rang once more as the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before. It was heavier, but also clearer, stripped of pretense. The waitress felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had not realized she was carrying until it began to fade. The older man returned to his table, sat down and reached for his wallet. When the waitress approached hesitantly to clear his place, he looked up at her. "You did nothing wrong," he said quietly. She swallowed, nodding, unable to find words that felt adequate. He left a generous tip on the table and stood, offering her a small, reassuring smile before turning toward the door. As he left, the bell rang again, its sound no longer sharp but oddly comforting. The diner resumed its rhythm, but nothing felt quite the same. The calm voice that had broken the silence still echoed in the air, leaving behind the promise that some patterns, once disrupted, could not be easily restored. The diner did not immediately return to life after the door closed behind the officer. Sound came back slowly, as if the room itself needed time to adjust. A fork clinked against a plate. Someone cleared their throat. The grill in the kitchen resumed its steady hiss, filling the silence that had lingered just a moment too long. Yet something fundamental had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if no one could name it aloud. The waitress stood near the counter, her hands resting on its edge, her body still half expecting the tension to snap back into place. Her eyes followed the space where the officer had been, the empty booth now looking strangely ordinary. Just a few minutes earlier, it had felt like the center of gravity for the entire room. Now it was only vinyl and a table with a cooling cup of coffee. She waited for the familiar rush of fear, the delayed realization that consequences were coming. It did not arrive. Instead, there was a fragile calm, unfamiliar and almost unsettling in its quietness. Her breathing slowed, and with it came a cautious awareness of her own posture. She noticed she was standing straighter than before. Around her, the patrons avoided one another's eyes. No one commented on what had happened. There were no questions, no speculation spoken aloud. Yet understanding moved through the room like an unspoken agreement. People had seen enough. They had seen who left first and how. They had seen who returned unchanged and who did not. The manager hovered near the register, his expression strained. He glanced toward the door, then toward the waitress, then away again. For the first time since the incident, his gaze lingered on her with something close to uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, choosing silence over a conversation he did not know how to begin. The waitress returned to work slowly, almost cautiously, as though testing the ground beneath her feet. Each step felt different now, not because the floor had changed, but because she had. She cleared a table, wiped it down, and moved to the next one. No one laughed, no one made a comment. A woman at one booth offered her a small, apologetic smile, one that carried both sympathy and regret. She did not know how to respond to that, so she nodded and kept moving. At the far end of the diner, the older man sat quietly finishing his meal. He did not look around to gauge reactions. He did not seek acknowledgement. He had already done what he came to do, even if he had not known it when he walked in that morning. Now he allowed the room to settle on its own terms. The officer did not return. Minutes passed, then more. The lunch rush began to thin as customers paid their bills and filtered out, the bell above the door ringing with a softer frequency. With each departure, the diner felt lighter, less compressed by the unspoken weight that had hung over it for so long. The waitress noticed the absence more clearly with every passing moment. She realized how accustomed she had become to anticipating his presence, adjusting her movements and tone to avoid provoking him. The relief of not having to do that felt almost disorienting, like stepping out of a storm she had been walking through for so long she had forgotten what clear air felt like. When she approached the older man's table, she hesitated, unsure whether he needed anything else. He looked up at her and shook his head gently. "No, thank you," he said. She reached for the bill, but he had already taken care of it. The tip he left was more than generous, but it was not the amount that caught her attention. It was the deliberateness of the gesture, the way the money was placed neatly on the table rather than tossed aside. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Just remember what you saw today." She nodded again, her throat tight. She wanted to say more, to express gratitude or ask questions, but the moment did not call for words. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and moved toward the door without looking back. The bell rang as he left, and this time, the sound did not carry tension with it. It rang like punctuation, marking the end of something that had gone on too long. After he was gone, the diner continued its slow return to normal. The manager finally approached the waitress, his voice subdued. "You handled yourself well," he said, the words stiff and unfamiliar in his mouth. She looked at him, surprised not by the compliment, but by the lack of an apology. She realized then that she did not need one from him. Whatever had kept him silent before was still there, but it no longer defined her place in the room. "I just did my job," she replied. He nodded, relieved by the simplicity of the exchange, and retreated behind the counter once more. The afternoon light shifted as clouds passed overhead, changing the color of the diner in subtle ways. Shadows moved across the floor. The world outside continued as it always had, indifferent to what had taken place inside these walls. Yet for those who had been there, the memory lingered, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet understanding. No one had seen what happened in the parking lot, and no one needed to. The result spoke for itself. The waitress finished her shift later than expected, exhaustion settling into her bones now that the adrenaline had faded. As she untied her apron and hung it on its hook, she caught her reflection in the same metal panel she had faced earlier that day. This time she barely recognized the person looking back at her. She did not look fearless. She looked tired, still, but there was something steadier in her eyes, a firmness that had not been there before. She realized that for the first time, she was not replaying the moment of humiliation. Instead, she was remembering the moment someone had stepped forward. When she stepped outside, the air was cool and clean. The parking lot was quiet, empty of the patrol car that had once been parked there. She paused for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the silence settle around her. Inside the diner, life went on. Orders were placed, coffee was poured, but beneath the surface, the old rules had been disturbed. Silence had been challenged, and once challenged, it could not fully return to its previous form. They had not seen what happened outside, but they understood, and that understanding was enough to change everything. The diner opened the next morning the way it always had. The same bell rang above the door. The same smell of coffee and grease drifted through the room. The same booths waited for the same regulars. On the surface, nothing had changed. Anyone walking in for the first time would have seen only a familiar place continuing its routine, unaware that something subtle but irreversible had already taken root. The waitress arrived early, her steps slower than usual, her body still heavy from the long shift the day before. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by half-remembered images and moments that replayed themselves without invitation. Yet when she pushed open the door and stepped inside, she felt it immediately. The air was different, not lighter exactly, but clearer, as though something stale had finally been let out. She tied her apron and moved behind the counter, exchanging quiet greetings with the cook and the manager. The manager nodded at her, hesitated, then offered a faint smile. It was not warm, and it was not brave, but it was something. She returned it without effort, surprised by how little it cost her to do so. As the morning passed, customers filtered in. A few glanced around the room as if expecting something to be out of place. Others settled into their usual seats without comment. The booth near the center remained empty longer than it normally did. No one mentioned it, but the absence was noticed. The space where the officer had once sat now felt neutral, stripped of the gravity it had carried for so long. The waitress moved through the diner with a steadiness that surprised her. She was still tired. Her feet still ached. The work was no easier than it had been before, yet she noticed that her shoulders no longer hunched instinctively when she passed certain tables. She was no longer mapping her movements around a single presence, no longer bracing herself for a voice she did not want to hear. A woman at one booth thanked her quietly when she brought over a plate, meeting her eyes for a moment longer than necessary. A man at the counter tipped more than usual and said nothing about it. These were small things, easily dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that did not go unnoticed. The manager watched her from behind the counter, his expression thoughtful. He said nothing, but he intervened once when a customer raised his voice unnecessarily, stepping in with an authority he had not displayed before. The exchange was brief and awkward, but it happened. The waitress caught it from the corner of her eye and felt something settle inside her, not gratitude, but recognition. The day moved on. By the afternoon, the diner had fallen into a familiar rhythm again, but the rhythm had shifted slightly, like a song played at a different tempo. The silence that once governed the room no longer felt absolute. It had cracks now, thin but visible, where sound and resistance could slip through. The waitress thought of the older man as she wiped down a table near the window. She did not know where he had gone or what his life looked like beyond that brief intersection with hers. She knew only what he had done and the way it had altered the course of her day and perhaps her future. His words returned to her unbidden. You did nothing wrong. They did not feel like comfort anymore. They felt like truth. She realized that she had been measuring herself against other people's expectations for so long that she had forgotten how to define her own. The humiliation she had endured had not been hers to carry, no matter how often it had been placed in her hands. Seeing that, truly seeing it, was unsettling. It left her unsure of what came next, but also strangely unafraid. The officer did not return that day. He did not return the next. At first, the waitress caught herself listening for the familiar cadence of his voice, the heavy sound of his boots. Each time the door opened, her body reacted before her mind could intervene. But with each passing day, the reaction faded. The absence grew into something solid, reliable. It became a fact rather than a hope. Other customers noticed it too. Conversations shifted subtly. The tone of the room softened. Laughter sounded different, less forced. The diner had not become a sanctuary, nor had it transformed into something idealized. It remained what it had always been, a place where people came to eat, to pass time, to exist alongside one another. But one source of fear had been removed, and the space it left behind was noticeable. One evening, as the waitress counted out her tips, she realized that she was no longer dreading the next shift. The thought surprised her. Work was still work. The hours were still long, but the dread, that constant low-level tension she had mistaken for normal, had loosened its grip. She stepped outside after closing and stood for a moment beneath the fading light, watching the sky darken above the parking lot. The world beyond the diner continued in all its indifference and complexity. Nothing about it had changed because of what happened here, and yet something within her had. She understood now that silence was not neutral. It was a choice, one that protected some at the expense of others. She had lived inside that silence for too long, accepting it as the cost of survival. Watching it break, even briefly, had shown her another way of existing, one that did not rely on endurance alone. Inside, the manager locked up and turned off the lights one by one. The diner settled into darkness, quiet and waiting. Tomorrow it would open again. People would return. Life would go on. But the memory would remain, carried quietly by those who had been there. Not as a story retold loudly, but as an understanding that settled into behavior, into posture, into the way people chose to look at one another. The waitress walked to her car and paused before getting in, taking one last look at the building. It was still just a diner on a corner, worn and ordinary, yet for her it had become the place where something ended and something else began. She drove away feeling tired, yes, but steadier than she had in a long time. Fear had not vanished from her life, but it no longer ruled it. She knew now that silence could be broken, and that once broken, it never returned quite the same. Somewhere beyond the reach of the diner's lights, the older man continued on his way, carrying with him no need for acknowledgement or praise. He had stepped in when it mattered, and then he had stepped away. That was enough. In the end, no speeches were made. No apologies were demanded. Justice did not arrive with ceremony or applause. It came quietly through action and consequence, leaving behind a subtle but lasting change. And in that change, the diner learned how to breathe again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Watch the next video on your screen to keep the story going, and share this video with someone who believes in justice. It really helps the channel grow.